everyone. My name's Clay Wirestone. I'm opinion editor for Kansas Reflector.
I'm editor-in-chief Sherman Smith.
And we are here for so many reasons. Sherman, so many reasons. The Kansas legislature on Thursday and Friday of last week wrapped up the 2026 session. They said that was that. They're gone. They are not coming back.
We will have to wait until January and a whole new cast in the House to have this kind of fun again.
But that being said, we have a lot of other things going on too. So we're going to fill you in on the end of the session. But first, we'll also note that today at the Kansas Reflector, there's going to be a column and the first installment of a series of stories about the legislature. And Sherman, why don't you tell us a little bit about that, just at the top?
That's right. I should note, too, this is a special crossover edition of both the Kansas Reflector podcast as well as our video series.
Well, an easy way to tell which version you have is that if you see us here, then that's the video version. But if you're just hearing us, then it's probably the audio podcast.
That's right. So we have a special series rolling out that our staff has been working on for several months now, actually. We thought about doing this really early in the legislative session and started tracking kind of the ways in which the majority party, the supermajority party, the Republicans, have exploited process to advance their agenda. They've silenced opposition. They've used a number of rules or bend the rules sometimes to do this. It's everything from using a rule called calling the question to end debate, to complaining that somebody's impugning their motives to make them stop talking, just disregarding the work that others in the State House are doing. And we can get into more of this later in the episode.
Well, and it's just important to understand that, laws do not just, burst into flower one day. Like, there actually is a way that the idea goes from something in someone's head to text to going through committees and the floor, and there's an expected way that happens, and then there's what actually happens. And so that's what this series is going to be about. But now, Sherman, talking about the end of the session, that Thursday and Friday, the 9th and 10th of April, some big things actually did happen. There's some big things happened, that there were bills passed, that the governor signed, that are pretty meaningful. So what are those?
Yeah, we'll get into what she vetoed and how all that turned out. But, I think it's worth noting that she did sign a lot of the bills that the legislature had passed prior to coming back. And some of those were things that had gotten, a little heated at times. She signed regulations for pharmacy benefit managers, kind of the middlemen who, critics say are driving up the cost of prescription drugs. This is trying to rein that in a little bit. She signed a bill that basically evicts everybody who's currently on the state nursing board and voids all of the administrative violations that nurses have had for the past 20 plus years. And of course, very exciting for our Kansas City audience who are Chiefs fans. They passed the Sports Authority. That's one of the linchpins that makes the deal go forward with the Kansas City Chiefs. Coming across state lines, building a stadium, building a headquarters in another complex. The Sports Authority will basically own the stadium and govern all of this. And there's some, I think, heartburn about who is going to get a voting voice on that. They're now allowing the mayors of these cities that are impacted in the Kansas City metro to have a voting voice, but they have to buy into the bond program. So all that, she signed that, and that's how that played out.
Well, and even though there had been some kind of grassroots, ground level kind of protest or agitation about some of the chiefs, all of the frou-frou surrounding the new Chiefs Stadium and all that, it didn't ultimately end up translating to any sort of real delay. Like the bills rolled through, she passed them, it just happened.
Yeah, if you'd put this to a public vote, it was never going to get done. But, people like Governor Laura Kelly, who's on her way out of office, have nothing to lose by making it happen.
Well, and legislative leaders appeared to be pretty bought into it as well.
A majority, at least. Yeah.
So moving on, there was a bill that establishes, and I guess this is the law now, it's going to establish a new civics test for Kansas high school students who are graduating. It's a requirement to graduate, correct?
Yeah, the legislature has talked about this in various forms throughout the year. When they came back for this 2-day wrap-up session, they did actually get it over the finish line in terms of passing a bill that would require students to learn that socialism and fascism are bad, and then pass a civics test that's based on the U.S. citizenship test. So this did pass the legislature. The governor could veto it. We'll have to wait and see. The objection here is that they are actually treading on the constitutional authority of the State Board of Education. They're the ones who are supposed to set curriculum. So it wouldn't surprise me if the governor vetoed it. We'll have to wait and see.
Well, and if she does veto it, there's really no way for it to become law now because the legislature is out of town. They're not coming back.
That's right.
So, as we're talking about vetoes, the governor also handed out a lot of them.
Yeah, and historically, Democratic governors will veto a few things. Governor Kathleen Sebelius was known for vetoing quite a few things, but I don't think even her number of vetoes rose to what we've seen under Laura Kelly in recent years. It's somewhat rare for a Republican governor to veto a bill that comes from the Republican legislature, but increasingly, we've seen this legislature refuse to work with the governor or Democrats in general. And so just a shocking number of bills, I think, are getting vetoed every year. This year, the governor vetoed at least 24 bills and also 31 line items in the state budget. I think that's a lot.
Well, and it's important to note, too, that, this is perhaps getting a little bit into the process side of the equation, what our new series is about. The governor and Democrats would likely be open to collaborating with Republicans on all manner of legislation, including perhaps some of these bills that were vetoed, depending on the subjects. It's just that there's just no interest from Republicans to necessarily do that.
Yeah, you would typically see some horse trading where maybe Democrats would hold their nose and vote for a bill that they don't like overall in exchange for getting some input into the finer points of it or a little piece of something they want added in. But there's been, for the most part, none of that. It's Republicans are going to do whatever they want, and they don't even care if the Democrats have a say at all.
Well, and I think the big kind of supposedly bipartisan thing this year was the cell phone ban for high schools. That did eventually make it through, but that was one.
Yeah.
Moving on, Sherman, you were talking about the line item vetoes in the budget. The budget, as we've said, as we've talked about throughout this podcast series, the one thing that the legislature has to do, they have to pass a budget. That budget also has to be balanced. It has to add up it has to zero out by the end, even if that means dipping into the savings account, as it does again this year. What were some sticking points there on the budget?
The main thing here is that the governor and Democrats really wanted a significant pay raise for the executive branch employees, for state government workers. I think they were looking for like a 3% pay raise. The legislature, because of a mechanism they put in place a couple of years ago, lawmakers were giving themselves a 4% pay raise. They also inserted a 10% pay raise for their staff, the people who work in the State House. Governor Laura Kelly sent a signal by vetoing the legislature's budget in its entirety, meaning the legislature, as of July, would not be able to operate at all. None of their staff would be paid at all. Obviously not very realistic. Democrats said, let's sustain this veto and force Republicans to come back with a single bill that actually gives state employees a pay raise and funds the legislature how Republican leaders wanted to. But with some high drama in the House in particular and some twisting of arms, they were able to override this veto so that state employees get just 1% raise. The state legislators will get their 4%, their staff will get their 10%. It's interesting. We heard a lot of speeches from people like Representative Blake Carpenter, a Republican from Derby, talking about how important it is for legislators to be well compensated so that we can get a better, broader range of candidates to run, which I think is a reasonable assertion. He also talked about how, and others did, how great and important and valuable the work is of the legislative staff in making sure all of this happened. They could point to people on the floor and say, I'm so glad so-and-so over there is here doing this work late on a, Thursday night or Friday night, whatever. They offered none of that appreciation for the state employees, the thousands of state employees who do also very important work at all these other agencies. So that was one of the big items in the budget. They also included in that overriding her line item veto of parking privileges for state legislators. A handful of legislators were upset because there's a parking lot that the Department of Revenue leases over by the Cyrus Hotel in downtown Topeka. There is signage that says you're not supposed to park here during certain hours, but legislators who didn't want to be bothered to walk the 2 blocks from their free parking at the State House were parking over in this lot during hours where they're not supposed to. Towing company would just come around and, as they would with anybody else, tow their vehicles off. I think this would cost $250 or something. Apparently, the Department of Revenue was reimbursing legislators for their towing fees. They inserted into the budget a proviso to make it clear that state lawmakers can basically park wherever the hell they want if it's a lot that's leased or owned by the state. The other big thing to talk about, of course, in the budget was there's a provision dealing with the student walkouts that makes it so that students in schools, K-12 public schools, are not allowed to walk out and protest anymore. And if they are, there's real punishment. They have to come back for an extra day of school at the end of the year. Schools are fined, I think, the equivalent of a superintendent's annual salary. It's just a way to really crack down on students, particularly because they were protesting ICE activity earlier this year. So they were able to override that veto.
In terms of other vetoes that Kelly issued from that big, bountiful bevy of vetoes, several were sustained, as in there were not sufficient votes to override them. What were a handful of those?
Yeah, the governor vetoed some onerous voting restrictions. We talked about those earlier this year in our video form of this conversation. These were some of the things that the Secretary of State's office wanted, but also things that Representative Pat Proctor, who runs the House Elections Committee and is running for Secretary of State, he wanted to get through. There was a bill that she vetoed that would have banned in-state tuition for immigrants, something that's happened for the past 2 decades now. So that's preserved. They were unable to override her veto on this bill that would allow for-profit veteran claim consultants to get a portion of veterans' claims for helping them file for that assistance, for those benefits, I should say. This is a service that's offered for free by other organizations. So that went down, and then there's also a bill trying to dictate how state assessments are scored for K-12 schools. So those are all the things that she vetoed that the legislature was not able to override. Those things will stay vetoed.
But the things that they did override included...
Yeah, quite a bit that they did override. Some of the highlights here, there's a bill that's going to put more kids in prison longer. This is overturning kind of a signature law from a former representative, Russ Jennings, from 10 years ago.
Well, overturning parts of it, not
yeah.
necessarily the entire thing.
There's a couple of voucher programs that the state's going to buy into. One of them a federal program. These are just tax credits for sending kids to private schools. There's a bill that we're concerned about as journalists that creates a 25-foot safety zone for police and first responders. Part of this has to do with protesters and ICE agents as they're detaining individuals. But what's concerning to us is it, makes it difficult for journalists to get anywhere near a police officer in the line of duty to try to observe or ask questions. That becomes a crime now. They passed a bill supposedly honoring Charlie Kirk and free speech, but there's some hang-ups about what that actually does on college campuses.
Well, like a lot of things that we've talked about before, again in these videos this session, so many of these bills establish essentially bases for people to file civil claims against other people or other institutions. And I believe that part of essentially how this quote-unquote free speech bill works is that if you feel as though your ability to express free speech is being somehow smothered or covered up by someone else, you then have a claim to file against them.
Also, some concerns that this legalizes discrimination by student groups on college campuses. And of course, there's some irony here that they're telling students at the K-12 level that they're not allowed to protest, while saying that if you're on a college campus, you have to be allowed to say whatever you want. There are a couple of anti-abortion bills that they overrode the vetoes on. I think the most egregious is one that will require the State Department of Health and Environment to deliver false information that is actually harmful to women about supposedly being able to override a medication abortion. And then there's this housing bill we've talked about before that landlords wanted to be able to disregard the assistance that people get for housing. So if you have either veterans or other programs where you get government assistance to pay for housing, to pay for your rent, landlords want to be able to say, this means you're poor and we don't want you in our place. The city of Lawrence had an ordinance that said you have to recognize that as income when you're looking at their overall income. This was litigated a couple of times. Landlords lost both those cases, so they turned to the legislature with some supposed threats about leaving the state, although the one that's really behind this, who owns a ton of property in Lawrence and elsewhere, I think is also the voice of the Wildcats. Hard to believe that he would actually leave the state if they refused to do this, but they were able to override that veto anyway.
And then finally, we come to kind of the issue that had been hovering over the legislature for so much of the session, and that was, of course, property taxes. I mean, also the challenge being that most property taxes are leveled by cities and counties, so the state government doesn't even get a huge amount of say in them. There was a property tax bill passed right as legislators left. Kelly vetoed that, and so they put together kind of a revised version of that during the last couple of days.
Yeah, this has been a lot of back and forth all year. The Senate, particularly Senate President Ty Masterson, wanted a constitutional amendment that would cap assessments, property assessments, each year. The House response was, let's find a way to actually cap the increases in spending that are happening at the local level. So this tension back and forth basically meant that there wasn't enough votes to get the constitutional amendment through, so they had to go to a bill, and that gave the House the leverage to do really what they wanted. This bill is something that effectively puts a lid on the local property tax increases to hold them at no more than 3%, or the whatever the consumer price index was that year, the Midwest Consumer Price Index. So hold it at inflation or 3%, whichever number is lower. And if you want to go beyond that, they allow 10% of voters, just 10% of the voters who participated in the most recent election for Secretary of State, which is a curious number to choose, they can sign a petition and block the increase, and it'll go back automatically to either that 3% or the inflation number, whichever is lower. There are some exemptions to this. Schools are exempt, so is new construction. One of the curious things about this, going into that 2-day session, caught some people by surprise. Leadership actually took over negotiations of this. Usually you have, 2 rank and file Democrats and 4 Republicans who are either committee chairs, rank and file Republicans, leading the negotiations, 3 for the Senate, 3 for the House. They came in and said, okay, the very top leadership is going to take this over. So you had Dan Hawkins and Ty Masterson sitting across from each other, working out this deal in the conference committee to get this over the finish line. And of course, as soon as they get it to the floor, the first thing the Senate President, Ty Masterson, says is, this is not my idea of a good tax relief plan, but it's what we could do. So, here it is. Tepid support. It passed both chambers. So it's headed to the governor. Presumably, she will veto this because there's a lot of opposition from Democrats, particularly on the Senate side, particularly from her chosen successor, Ethan Corson, senator, who's running for the Democratic nomination for governor. But the drama didn't end there. They came back at the end to make a last-ditch effort to get one of Ty Masterson's constitutional amendments through the Senate. The House was already done with their business. It's 1:00 in the morning. The Senate's debating this. They're trying to force senators to come back who had gone home and vote before they wrap it up. And so we saw at least 20 or 30 House members, including Republicans, go into the Senate, line the walls, and stare them down to try to force the debate to come to a halt. So somewhere around 1:30 in the morning Saturday, they finally gave in and said, we're done for the year.
Well, and it's a lot of drama. It really highlights, I think, something that we've also mentioned before, which is as much as we talk about Democrats versus Republicans, there's real cross-chamber tension. The House as a body has certain things it wants. The Senate as a body has certain things it wants. To an extent, it's just the different leagues of Republicans. Republicans in the Senate are different than Republicans in the House. But there are just real differences of opinion there, and it really stymied the property tax discussion this year.
I'm curious, a couple of years ago when there was a lot of this kind of back and forth, and they were trying to get an income tax cut that they couldn't all agree on, and the governor vetoed it again. She ended up calling a special session to make that happen. I would just note, and I haven't heard anything that would suggest that she plans to call a special session, but it wouldn't surprise me if she vetoes this property tax bill. She'd outlined her own plan for property tax relief right before lawmakers came back. They, of course, considered zero of it, but her plan would give everybody a one-time $250 tax credit for registering when they go to register their vehicles. It would create a $60 million fund, annual fund that would grow with the rate of inflation, that would go to local governments that maintain spending increases below 3% each year. They would get a portion of this to then lower the property tax burden for their local residents. And the state would also, under the governor's plan, raise the amount of a home value that is exempt from the state's 20 mil tax levy. So I think that's another 120 million or so in tax relief. It would go from right now, the first 75,000 of your home is exempt from the state's tax. This would say the first 150,000 would be exempt. So the governor outlined a plan that in total would be about 500 million in property tax relief. Got no attention during this wrap-up session. We're curious to see if there's any appetite for bringing people back to consider that.
Given the realities of campaign season, which pretty much everyone has now jumped into, it would be surprising. But of course, stranger things have happened.
But wouldn't it be funny for a governor who has already shown with her veto of the legislative budget an appetite for spiting lawmakers on her way out the door to bring them back weeks before the primary election this summer?
Yeah, although that would then be a surefire way to perhaps get some bills passed that she wouldn't want to deal with.
That's always the dynamic in this calling a special session.
I also want to just emphasize for folks who are listening or watching, this is our best understanding of all of these bills and all of this legislative action at this time. As we have said before, so much happens in such a short amount of time here that honestly, throughout Thursday and Friday, and then frankly over this weekend, we're all still trying to figure everything out. There are intricacies and clauses and things going on here that frankly, I suspect a lot of the lawmakers don't understand or quite know about either.
I mean, frankly, we wrote so many stories as a staff Friday and into the evening that we decided not to publish them all Friday night because we didn't know that people would want to wake up Saturday morning and read 20 stories. So we've hung on to some of those we published Saturday and Sunday. We'll continue publishing this week along with our process series.
I mean, we haven't even gotten to, at least at this point, haven't even gotten to some of that last minute action that Sherman was talking about.
Yeah.
Switching now to the series, which is not really that much of a switch because it's still about the legislature and it's still about how it runs. Give us an understanding, Sherman, a little bit about what are we kind of covering on some of these days? What are some of the big subjects that we're looking at?
Yeah, it started down this path at the top of this conversation. The Monday story from senior reporter Tim Carpenter is about calling the question. This is just like a magic phrase that you can whisper on the floor during debate to end the debate and go straight to a vote. This came up, of course, during the vote, the veto override vote on the anti-trans bill. Just very conveniently, we don't want to listen to 40 Democrats in the House complain about this. We're just going to call the question, end the debate, go straight to the vote.
And all it takes is a majority vote, correct?
Yes. The Senate started to do this, and then it wasn't necessary. They decided to just go ahead and vote without challenging the motion to call the question. Tim gives us some historical perspective of how this has been used over the years, and some people who think that there is a place for it if people are just going to go on and on with repetitive stuff, or they just want to bring a bunch of symbolic amendments that could derail an important piece of legislation. Maybe there's a purpose for having this in the rule book. But what we saw this year, which is a common refrain, is it's really being used now just to silence opposition. Republicans don't like to hear people say you're wrong about something. And that really gets us into the second day story from reporter Anna Kaminsky, which is about another rule against impugning the motives of members of the House and the Senate. This was used more than a dozen times in the House this year, mostly on the floor, sometimes in committees where somebody starts to get a little mean and hurt the Republicans' feelings, and so they say, "Oh no, you can't hurt our feelings. You're impugning our motives. You have to stop this." And it's an effective tool for putting Democrats on their heels, making them defensive about what they're saying, and really altering the course of that debate. We also in that story reveal a very interesting email that a Republican sent to an advocate after she had been admonished during a committee for impugning motives. The legislator told her she needed to learn when to shut up and asked that she bring her husband to testify in her place.
And I think it's important to note here with impugning motives that, that the way in which Sherman and I, or Sherman and his wife, or me and my husband, or, the way any two random people discuss politics in the real world is not the way that politics are discussed in the legislature, and especially not in like a formal proceeding of the House or the Senate. And what you normally say about somebody, which is, "Oh my gosh, this person's a jerk who's doing this jerky thing," that's not acceptable. And honestly, even in these cases that we're writing about, very seldom do lawmakers even go remotely that far. Oftentimes what they do is they're talking about the effects that a bill will have and say that the bill is perhaps motivated by animus or prejudice of some sort. And lawmakers then make the jump to say, "Oh, that's impugning my character. That's saying I'm a bad person to say that the bill, is motivated by these things." But it's frankly difficult to have an honest conversation sometimes without doing that.
Yeah, I think the level of sensitivity was so much higher this year than in any of the other, this is the 9th session that I've covered. And, it's hard, as you say, Democrats want to say what you're doing here in this anti-trans bill, for instance, is going to hurt trans people. Republicans don't like hearing that. There's some challenges to this Charlie Kirk bill and the hypocrisy of it. They don't like hearing that they're hypocrites. It's that kind of stuff that we're talking about.
And then on Wednesday, I believe it is, it's your turn.
That's right.
And you're writing about fiscal notes.
Yeah, the very exciting world of estimating how much a bill is going to cost. The interesting thing about this to me is that, there's a 3-year-old audit that some House members heard about. There's a committee where they brought in auditors to just kind of explain the findings of this to them. And what they concluded was 7 out of the 10 fiscal notes that they looked at were inaccurate. The reason why they were inaccurate is because the bills change after the fiscal note is created. This put me down a strange new world where I had to learn about the fiscal notes. There's actually a state statute that says the budget staff is required to produce a fiscal note within 7 days of a bill being entered. They do all of this diligent work to try to find the best estimate they can for these things. And then half the time or more, that work goes out the window because the bill changes and there's no mechanism for asking them to update that work and create a new fiscal note. And then there's some other reasons why this is difficult. Like one of the examples of the fiscal notes that had failed was a new tax credit that was particularly challenging to forecast. Or there was an agency that said, we think we need one new employee to do this work, and then turned out to, because they changed their processes, only needed a half of an employee's time to do that work. So that kind of stuff factors into it as well. But what got me interested was, after hearing this, there were several Republicans, both the House and Senate, who would just say, oh, well, we know from this audit that the fiscal notes aren't reliable anyway, so we don't have to pay attention to the cost estimates. And this comes up over and over again where Republicans say, we want to do this controversial policy. Democrats would say, but look at how much it's going to cost. And Republicans could say, oh no, we don't have to pay attention to any of those concerns because we don't have to trust the fiscal notes, even though they knew that was a totally disingenuous way of reviewing this audit.
And then moving on, we keep going on Thursday
right.
and Friday.
Yeah, Thursday we've got a story from Morgan Chilson, senior reporter, really looking at the ways that lawmakers try to avoid having public input in their policy by rushing hearings right after a bill is introduced, or not telling people when a hearing is going to be, or taking action on bills for things that don't even show up in the calendar. They'll declare an emergency, for instance, to bring a bill straight to the floor and have a vote, and then declare an emergency to move it to final action and go ahead and get it done. So there's never an opportunity for the public to even know that they're going to vote on this before it happens. So that's the day 4 story. We close out the week. Of course, we should couch this by saying that, if there's breaking news, the order of these could change around, but this is the plan at the time of this recording. The final day, we're looking at the speed of the session. Republican leaders this year, and we've talked about this before, Republican leaders arbitrarily chose to dramatically tighten the deadline for when the session would end. Ended up with about the same number of days of work this session, but typically their final day of the session would be in May. They wouldn't come back to that final 2 days that we were just talking about would actually be the first week of May, typically. By condensing this, they had to tighten the deadlines for when bills could be introduced, for getting them through one chamber or the other, rushing to write policy. They had beleaguered staff. And, one of the effects here is that we have a research staff that's supposed to come back between the end of the regular session and the final wrap-up veto session and say, okay, we've done a final calculation of all the bills that you passed before, and we have new revenue estimates. And so you can run a trailer bill that makes final adjustments to the budget about, okay, all those policies that we passed, we now know exactly how much they're going to cost, and we have a better idea of how much revenue we're going to have. That doesn't happen anymore because there just isn't enough time. There were 8 calendar days between the end of the regular session and the veto session instead of the 3 weeks that we would usually have.
And it makes everything interesting. Let's put it that way. Well, and I really look forward to all of you having the chance to read this series, to understand kind of what our reporters have been finding out, because I think when you take all of this together, when you look at all of this in total, it's a pretty remarkable collection of material that really says a lot about how laws are passed or not passed in Kansas and what it means.
And there, could be more stories along this theme to come.
So Sherman, thank you so much for coming. We have to say, and this is for our video viewers, we've heard a lot of response from folks about wanting us to continue to do these videos, and I think that we probably will do that.
Yeah,
Sherman.
I think so. Not sure what exactly that will look like in terms of frequency or length yet, or
we will rejoin you. Possibly taking a week off again, but we will rejoin you again on a regular basis for some weekly videos. So we look forward to doing that, and we're glad that people have watched and listened, of course.
And as always, thank you for
Oh, yeah.
subscribing.
Yes, please subscribe to Kansas at kansasreflector.com/subscribe. That's kansasreflector.com/subscribe for our daily newsletter. There's also a weekly roundup on Sundays.
That's right. The newsletters, as with all of our stories, are free to read.
So I'm Clay,
I'm Sherman.
and thanks so much.